The first thing I noticed was not the ceiling or the fluorescent light, but the strange weight in my body. I woke up slowly as if swimming through thick water, and the pain that greeted me was not the sharp sting I had been warned about before surgery. It was deeper, heavier, pulling at me in ways I did not understand. My throat was dry from the tube that had kept me breathing, and the steady beep of the monitor beside me reminded me that I was alive. But something felt wrong. The curtain around my bed shifted and a nurse leaned over me. She was young, with tired eyes, her braids tied neatly back. Her badge read Lisa. She smiled at me, but it was a nervous smile, the kind that did not reach her eyes. "There you are," she said softly. "How are you feeling?" "Sore," I whispered. My voice was hoarse. "It hurts more than I expected." "That is normal," she replied quickly, maybe too quickly. Then she glanced toward the doorway as if afraid someone might overhear. She pulled the curtain all the way around my bed, enclosing us in a small pocket of privacy. "Didn't they tell you about the second procedure?" My heart skipped. The monitor beside me began to beep faster, betraying the panic rising inside me. My mind scrambled to make sense of her words. What second procedure? I asked, my voice breaking. Lisa bit her lip, clearly regretting what she had just said. She looked down at the chart in her hands, then back at me. "I thought they had explained," she whispered. "The doctor said your stepfather approved it." The words crashed over me like cold water. Step, father, approved. My body tensed against the bed rails. I shook my head violently, the IV line tugging at my arm. "That is not possible. He cannot approve anything for me." Lisa looked even more uneasy. "I am sorry. I should not have said anything. The doctor will explain. Just rest." "No. Tell me what was done to me." My voice rose, but it was weak, cracked by fear. She did not answer. She just pressed a button to check my fluids and whispered again. "Please try to stay calm. The doctor will come soon." Stay calm. Stay calm. When a stranger just told me that a man who had no right over my body might have decided something permanent while I was unconscious. Stay calm when my stomach was screaming with pain that did not make sense. My mind flashed back to before the surgery, the paperwork I had barely been able to see through the haze of pain. I remembered Victor's hand on my shoulder, steady, heavy. I remembered the way he spoke for me, told the nurse to hurry, told me not to worry. The pen had felt like it weighed 100 pounds when they pushed it into my hand. Had I signed something I did not understand, or had someone signed for me? The thought made me sick. I pressed my hand against my abdomen, feeling the bandages, the swollen ache beneath. It should have been one incision, maybe two, but the soreness spread lower, deeper. I turned back to Lisa, desperate now. Please, tell me, what did they do to me?" She shook her head, her eyes glassy with guilt. "I could lose my job. I have already said too much. The doctor will be here soon. He will explain." I wanted to scream, to rip the IV out and run until I found someone who would tell me the truth. But my body was too weak, too stitched together, and all I could do was lie there while the fear built higher and higher inside me. The monitor beeped faster, still echoing my heart. My stepfather. He had always found ways to control me when I was awake. Now he had done it while I slept, and I had no idea yet what exactly he had taken from me. Before that day in the hospital, I had believed that my life, while not perfect, had some sense of order. I lived with my mother Margaret and my stepfather Victor in a 2-story house that looked picture perfect from the outside. Neighbors often complimented the rose bushes by the porch, the freshly painted shutters, the neatly cut lawn. To strangers, we looked like a family that had everything under control, but inside those walls, the air was heavy with tension, secrets, and fear. Margaret was gentle, timid, and desperate to keep peace at any cost. She had remarried after my father's death, telling everyone she was lucky to find stability again. What she never admitted out loud was that she was terrified of being alone, and that fear made her blind, or maybe deliberately ignorant of what Victor really was. Victor was charming to outsiders. He knew how to smile at church, how to shake hands firmly at business dinners, how to tell the kind of jokes that made everyone think he was just a hard-working man providing for his family. But behind closed doors, his mask slipped. His control seeped into everything. He decided what I wore, who I could talk to, how long I could spend out of the house. Any attempt to push back was met with anger. Sometimes it was a slammed door. Sometimes a hand gripping my arm too tightly. Sometimes worse. I still remembered one night when I was 15 and he accused me of disrespecting him because I came home late from a school rehearsal. He threw a glass against the wall so hard that shards cut into my leg. My mother rushed to get the first aid kit, but instead of confronting him, she whispered, "Please, Anna, just do as he says. We cannot afford to make him angry." That pattern never changed. Years later, the bruises came less often, but the control became sharper. He would look at me across the dinner table and say, "You need to learn that freedom is dangerous. I am the only one who knows what is best for you." Those words wrapped around me like chains. Gaslighting became his favorite weapon. When I cried about his temper, he said I was exaggerating. When I tried to explain how suffocated I felt, he told me I was ungrateful, that without him we would both be on the streets. And Margaret, my own mother, stood silently beside him, sometimes even nodding, her hands trembling as she clutched the dish towel or the cross around her neck. She would whisper later in my room, "Just keep quiet, Anna. You will only make things worse." Every time she said it, I felt another piece of trust break inside me. The worst part was how convincing he could be to others. At family gatherings, he would pat my shoulder, make some comment about me being headstrong, and everyone would laugh as if it was a harmless joke. No one saw the way his grip on my shoulder lingered just a little too long, or how his smile hardened when no one else was looking. When I was in college, I thought about leaving for good, cutting all ties, but money was always a chain. Victor kept the finances under his name, including the inheritance from my father that had been legally set aside for me until I turned 25. He managed it, or at least that is what he claimed. Every time I asked about it, he dismissed me with, "You are not ready to handle that kind of responsibility." I knew in my gut that the money was the reason he clung to me so tightly, but I could not prove it. Margaret, who should have defended me, always said, "Trust him, Anna. He provides for us. Do not stir up trouble." So I stayed, swallowing my pride, nursing my quiet anger, waiting for a time when I could finally breathe without his shadow looming over me. Yet there were moments, fleeting and cruel, when I almost convinced myself that things were normal. In the mornings when Margaret cooked pancakes and Victor read the newspaper at the table, I would think maybe today will not be so bad. But it never lasted. His mood could change with the smallest spark. One misplaced word, one sigh too loud, and the storm would come. He once ripped a notebook of mine into pieces because he thought I was wasting time writing instead of studying something useful. He grabbed my wrist so hard that I lost feeling in my fingers for hours. Later that night, he placed money on my desk and said, "I am sorry, I did not mean to scare you. I just want what is best." That was his pattern. Violence, apology, control, wrapped in the language of love. It kept Margaret trapped, and it was supposed to keep me trapped too. Looking back, I realize how he had been conditioning both of us. He needed to make us believe that he was the only anchor, the only one capable of deciding our future. My resentment grew, but so did my fear. I began to keep journals hidden under loose floorboards, writing down every incident, every slap, every insult, every controlling rule. It was my way of holding on to the truth, because he worked so hard to twist it. Sometimes he would corner me and say, "You imagine things that never happened. You are unstable. If anyone knew how you really act, they would lock you away." His voice was steady when he said it, so steady that part of me wondered if he was right. That was the worst part of living under his roof, the way he made me question my own reality. And Margaret, instead of pulling me out, pulled me deeper into his narrative with her pleas for peace. "You will understand one day," she told me once, tears in her eyes. "He only wants to protect us." Protect us, I thought. Protect us from what? From a world where I could breathe, where I could make my own decisions, where my father's money could actually give me independence. Protect us only meant protect his control. That was the life I lived before the surgery, the life that set the stage for the betrayal that was coming. A home that looked perfect but was rotten inside, a mother who loved me but feared her husband more, and a stepfather who believed my body, my choices, my very existence belonged to him. I had learned to endure, to stay silent, to pretend. I thought I knew how far he was willing to go, but I was wrong. I had not seen yet how far control could stretch, how deeply he could cut into my future. The surgery would show me. The hospital would become the place where all the years of hidden abuse finally surfaced, not because he lost his temper in a hallway or shouted in front of a neighbor, but because he decided to sign away something that was not his to take. The morning of the pain began like any other ordinary enough that I could never have guessed how quickly it would turn into disaster. I was at my desk reviewing notes for work when the stabbing sensation hit my lower right abdomen. It was so sharp that I doubled over the world blurring around me as I clutched my stomach. At first, I thought it was food poisoning, but the pain grew worse with every second until sweat dripped down my face. I called out for help and Victor appeared, his expression unreadable. He asked nothing about how I felt, but immediately grabbed his keys, telling me to get up, that we had to go to the hospital. He half carried me to the car, his grip firm, but not comforting, more like a command than concern. At the emergency room, I could barely stand upright. Nurses guided me onto a stretcher, their hands gentle, their voices kind. Victor answered all the questions for me, pulling out insurance cards, listing my medical history as if he owned it. Every time I tried to speak, he cut me off saying, "She is in too much pain. Just get her in, do what you need to do." A doctor confirmed appendicitis and said they would operate immediately. Through the haze of medication, I saw a clipboard being placed before me. The words blurred the letters, floating in and out of focus. I tried to read, but my body shook with agony. That is when I felt Victor's hand on my shoulder, heavy and insistent. "Just sign," he said. The nurse looked hesitant, but Victor leaned in and told her I was under his guardianship, that he would make sure everything was in order. In that fog, I barely scrawled something that looked like my name, but what I did not see was what happened after, when the real fraud took place. Later, I would learn that Victor and Dr. Collins slipped away to a side room with the forms, forging a neat, confident version of my signature, then adding Victor's bold hand under it, labeling him as the confirming guardian. With that, the door was open for more than just an appendectomy. I remember being wheeled into the operating theater, the anesthesiologist's voice asking me to count backward from 10. My last coherent thought was not about the appendix, but about the strange words Victor had whispered to Collins, something I could not catch clearly, but that made the hair on my arms stand up. Then, darkness swallowed me whole. When I woke up hours later, I expected the pain to be centered at one small spot. Instead, there was a broader ache, deep and unfamiliar. My hand went instinctively to my abdomen and I felt the bandages, but also something else, a weight in my pelvis that made no sense. Lisa's nervous glances, her whispered warning about a second procedure, replayed in my mind like a broken record. The fear grew heavier by the minute. I begged to see the doctor, and eventually Dr. Collins arrived. He sat by the bed with the calm arrogance of a man who believed his authority was unquestionable. "The surgery went well," he said smoothly, "but you should focus on recovery now." I asked him directly, "What was the second procedure?" His smile tightened, his eyes cold. "All procedures were legally authorized. There is nothing you need to worry about. Someone signed the forms for you." I told him my stepfather had no right, that it was my body. He simply repeated, "Everything is in order," and stood to leave. The dismissal was like another incision cutting into the little strength I had left. I called after him, but he was already gone, leaving me with questions and fear. The hours dragged until the room blurred from exhaustion, yet my mind refused to rest. My abdomen throbbed with every breath, a physical reminder that something had been taken. I replayed every detail leading up to the anesthesia, trying to piece together what Victor and Collins had done. The memory of Victor's steady hand on my shoulder as I struggled to sign made me nauseous. I began to suspect that my scribbled name had been nothing but a cover, a distraction from the forgery they intended to use. Lisa returned later with more medication and found me wide-eyed and trembling. I begged her again to tell me what had been done. She hesitated, her lips pressed tight as if sealing a secret, but the guilt in her eyes told me she knew more than she should. Finally, she whispered, "I cannot say details, but I can tell you this. It was not only your appendix. Your stepfather gave approval for something permanent." I felt the floor of my reality collapse beneath me. Permanent. The word lodged in my chest like a blade. I asked her again and again, but she only shook her head, saying she could not risk her job. Please, she begged me wait for the attending physician. He will explain, but I already knew I would get no explanation, only lies. The truth was being hidden behind signatures that were not mine, behind authority that was stolen. That night, as machines hummed around me and the hospital carried on with its quiet routine, I lay awake with the weight of dread pressing down on me. I understood then that Victor had crossed a line I had never believed he would cross. He had taken my voice while I was unconscious. He had stolen something from me that I could not yet name, and he had done it with the help of a doctor who was supposed to heal, not destroy. The next morning, Victor appeared in my hospital room carrying a bouquet of lilies, his suit pressed, and his expression perfectly arranged into the mask of a caring stepfather. To anyone watching, he looked like a man worried for his daughter, but to me, the flowers smelled like poison, a reminder that nothing he offered was ever genuine. He set the vase on the nightstand and leaned down to kiss my forehead, as if we shared intimacy instead of fear. "How are you feeling, Anna?" he asked in that smooth tone that could charm neighbors and priests, but always froze my blood. I stared at him and forced the words out. "What did you do to me?" He paused just long enough for his eyes to flicker with something sharp, then he smiled again. "What do you mean I did nothing but take care of you? You were sick, you needed surgery, and I made sure everything went smoothly." My voice shook, but I did not stop. "Lisa told me there was a second procedure." "What was it?" His smile hardened his jaw tight. "Do not listen to gossip. Nurses do not understand the bigger picture. You were in no condition to make choices. I had to step in." I pushed myself up despite the ache tearing at my abdomen. "You had no right." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I have every right. You are reckless, impulsive, weak. I have watched you crumble under the slightest pressure. Do you really think you could handle the responsibilities of a family of children of independence? I made the decision for you, the one you would have been too foolish to make." My heart raced, fury rising, but before I could reply, the door opened and Margaret walked in. Her face was pale, her hands twisting nervously around her purse straps. I thought she might support me, might finally break her silence, but instead, she rushed to Victor's side, touching his arm as though drawing strength from him. "Anna, please," she begged, "do not make a scene. The doctor said you need rest, and now you are shouting. People will think you are ungrateful, even unstable." I stared at her in disbelief. My own mother, the woman who should have defended me, was telling me to stay quiet, while the man who had controlled and hurt me confessed to taking away something from my body without consent. Victor straightened, emboldened by her loyalty, and looked down at me with a calm that made my skin crawl. "One day you will thank me," he said. "You will understand that I saved you from ruining your life." I could barely breathe, the rage pressing against my ribs. "Saved me," I spat. "You stole from me. You made choices that were never yours to make." He only shook his head as though I were a foolish child. "Your emotions make you blind." "I did what needed to be done." Margaret touched my arm, then her eyes wet, whispering, "Please, Anna, let it go. He is protecting us. Protecting us." The words echoed like a cruel joke. My hands trembled as I pulled away from her touch. Protecting me would have been letting me live my own life, not forging papers and cutting into my body while I slept. But neither of them saw it that way. To them, my anger was irrational, my resistance dangerous. Victor brushed imaginary dust from his sleeve and looked satisfied, as if the conversation was over. He told me to rest, that he would handle everything, that the best thing I could do was trust him. Then he left with Margaret trailing behind, casting me one last pleading glance, as if I were the one tearing the family apart. The silence they left behind was suffocating. I stared at the ceiling, my body aching, my heart shattered. In that moment, I understood completely that I was alone in this fight. The two people who should have stood beside me were united against me, gaslighting me until I questioned my own reality. The monitor beeped steadily, but all I could hear was Victor's voice repeating, "One day you will thank me." and I knew then with absolute clarity that I would never thank him, not in a day, not in a lifetime. Instead, I would find the truth, and when I did, he would face consequences he never imagined. That night, Lisa returned to my room with trembling hands, her eyes darting toward the hallway every few seconds as though she expected Victor to materialize from the shadows. She whispered that she could not sleep knowing what had been done to me and that I deserved to see the truth with my own eyes. From the pocket of her scrubs, she pulled a thin folder and slid it under my blanket. I opened it with shaking fingers, and there it was in black and white, the official surgical report listing not only appendectomy but also tubal ligation performed during the same operation. Beneath the procedure description was a shaky version of my signature that looked nothing like the scrawl I had forced onto the page in the waiting room, and beside it in bold ink was Victor's name signed confidently as guardian approval. My breath caught and the paper nearly slipped from my grasp. They had sterilized me. They had stolen the possibility of children of choice of future paths I had not even begun to explore. The walls of the hospital seemed to close in around me, but beneath the crushing weight of despair, there was also a spark, a sharp flare of rage that told me I could not let this end here. Lisa whispered that she could lose her job, maybe worse, but she wanted me to know that someone believed me. She squeezed my hand and told me to hold on to the file until I was discharged, then to hide it carefully. I promised her I would, and for the first time since the surgery, I felt less alone. When Rachel, my oldest friend, came to visit later that week, I showed her the documents. Her eyes filled with fury, and she said she had suspected for years that Victor's control would escalate. She hugged me and whispered, "We will bring him down, Anna. We will make sure everyone sees what he really is." Together, we contacted a lawyer, David Parker, known in our town for handling cases of abuse and malpractice with an iron will. When I sat in his office weeks later, pale and trembling, he listened without interrupting as I told him everything. His face grew harder with each detail, and when I placed the forged consent forms before him, he leaned back and said, "This is not only abuse, this is fraud, forgery, and medical assault." He promised to take the case, but warned me it would not be easy. Victor had money influence and a reputation carefully crafted to make him look like a pillar of the community. But David said the truth had a way of cutting through lies, and if I was brave enough to fight, he would stand with me. That was the beginning of the war. We started by gathering every scrap of evidence. Lisa agreed to give a statement, though she insisted her identity be protected until trial. Rachel helped me search Victor's study when he was away, using her quick fingers to unlock drawers and photograph documents. That was when we found the emails. Dozens of messages between Victor and Dr. Collins discussing logistics payments and the timing of the extra procedure. One email chilled me to the bone. Victor wrote, "We need to ensure she cannot jeopardize my control of the assets." Collins replied, "With proper paperwork, it will look legitimate." When I read those words aloud, my hands shook so violently that Rachel had to steady the paper for me. It confirmed everything I had suspected. Victor's motive was not only control over me, but over the inheritance my father had left. If I married, if I had children, if I built a life independent of him, he would lose the power he had clung to for years. So he decided to take away the possibility entirely to make sure my future was locked inside his version of the world. Rachel also revealed that months before fearing for my safety, she had placed a small camera in our living room. She had been worried he would cross another line and wanted proof. Now that footage became another weapon videos of Victor yelling, slamming me against walls, raising his hand while Margaret begged him to calm down. One recording even captured him saying, "I will never let you ruin what I have built, Anna. It will all stay under my control." David's eyes gleamed when he saw it. "This is gold," he said. "Combined with the medical fraud, it paints the picture of a man who believes he owns you." Still, he warned me we needed to be careful. Men like Victor did not surrender easily, and exposure could make him dangerous. That warning proved true when news of the case leaked to the local press. At first, it was whispers, then headlines. Stepdaughter claims unauthorized surgery files suit against stepfather and doctor. People who had once smiled at Victor on the street began to look at him with suspicion, and his temper at home grew more volatile. Margaret visited me once and pleaded, Why are you doing this to us, Anna? You are tearing the family apart. Do you want to see your stepfather destroyed? My answer was simple. He destroyed me first. She cried and said I was being dramatic, that Victor had only ever wanted to protect me, but her words rolled off me like water on stone. I no longer believed her excuses. The tide was turning. Soon, other whispers reached us. Women who had known Victor years ago began contacting David, telling stories of his controlling behavior, his manipulation, his threats. Some had dated him before he married Margaret and described the same pattern of charm followed by cruelty. One woman even claimed he had sabotaged her birth control during their relationship. Though not all could testify, their accounts created a pattern too clear to ignore. At the same time, the hospital began its own internal investigation when journalists demanded answers. Administrators scrambled to cover themselves, but leaks from inside revealed that Collins had been flagged before for questionable practices, though no one had pursued it. With the media storm brewing, our case gathered momentum. Rachel encouraged me to speak publicly, but I was not ready yet. The wounds were still raw, and I feared that if I faltered even once, Victor would twist my words. Instead, I focused on building the case with David, documenting every lie, every bruise from the past, every forged paper. The more we uncovered, the stronger my resolve became. Each night, I lay awake replaying Victor's smug voice in the hospital, telling me I would thank him one day, and each time I whispered to myself, "No, one day you will face justice." The fight consumed months of my life, but in that time I found strength I had not known I possessed. Rachel became my shield, Lisa my proof, David my strategist. Together, we were weaving a net strong enough to catch a man who had believed himself untouchable. And as the court date drew nearer, I felt the balance shifting. For the first time in years, Victor was not in complete control. He had underestimated me, and that would be his undoing. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and nerves the day the trial began, and I walked in with my stomach knotted not from surgical scars this time, but from the weight of knowing that everything would be decided here under the eyes of strangers. The courtroom was filled with reporters, neighbors, and people who had once admired Victor. He sat at the defense table in his best suit, his hair combed perfectly, his expression carefully schooled into that of a respectable man, unfairly accused. Margaret sat beside him, her hands folded, her eyes darting toward me with a mix of fear and blame, as if I were the one who had betrayed her instead of the daughter she had abandoned to protect her husband. My lawyer, David, laid out the case with a calm, deliberate voice, describing the unauthorized surgery, the forged signature, the financial motive, and the years of abuse that framed it all. He placed copies of the consent forms before the judge, pointing out the discrepancies in my signature, the suspicious neatness of the forged letters compared to the scrawl I had made under duress. He introduced the emails Rachel and I had found reading aloud, the line that made the room gasp. "We need to ensure she cannot jeopardize my control of the assets." Collins replied, "With proper paperwork, it will look legitimate." Victor shifted in his chair, then his jaw tightening, and for the first time, the mask of charm faltered. Dr. Collins took the stand, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly as he swore to tell the truth. He tried at first to paint the procedure as necessary, claiming it was discussed in advance, but under David's relentless questioning, his story unraveled. He was confronted with the emails with the suspicious payment records showing $15,000 transferred from Victor's account to his private consultancy the day before my surgery, and with Lisa's statement that she had overheard Collins telling Victor everything was ready once the forms were signed. His face grew red sweat trickling down his temple, and eventually he stammered that he had believed Victor when he said I had consented, but had been too rushed to verify. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. David's voice cut through the noise. "Doctor, is it standard practice to perform sterilization on a patient without speaking to her directly?" Collins could not answer. His silence spoke louder than any denial. Then it was Victor's turn. He rose to the witness stand with the arrogance of a man who still believed he could outtalk the truth. He spoke smoothly at first, insisting he had acted only out of love, that I was unstable, emotional, incapable of making rational decisions. He claimed I had often spoken of my fear of childbirth, that I had once confessed I never wanted children, that he had done me a favor by sparing me pain I could not handle. I shook my head furiously, and David allowed him to dig deeper to weave his own noose. Then David leaned forward and asked Mr. Victor, "Why did you pay Dr. Collins $15,000 the day before the surgery?" Victor's confident expression cracked. He stammered something about a consultation fee, but David pressed harder, producing the bank records and the email chains. The jury watched him squirm, watched the sweat gather on his brow. Finally, David asked, "Did you or did you not forge your stepdaughter's signature to authorize a procedure she never consented to?" Victor slammed his fist on the stand, shouting, "She would have ruined everything. She does not understand. She is a child, and I had to do what was best for all of us." The outburst hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. The jury stared in shock, reporters scribbled furiously, and I sat frozen, every muscle in my body trembling with vindication. He had admitted it not in those exact words, but in meaning, and everyone had heard it. Margaret jumped to her feet, crying out, "He is telling the truth." "Anna, you do not know what you are doing." But the judge silenced her. The gavel slammed down warning order back into the room, but the damage was done. The image of Victor as a respectable man was shattered. David then played the footage Rachel had captured months before the video of Victor shouting, slamming me against the wall, declaring he would never let me ruin what he had built. The screen flickered with proof of his violence, undeniable and raw. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Victor's face turned purple with rage, and he shouted that the video was taken out of context, that I had provoked him, but his words sounded hollow, desperate. The prosecutor added charges of abuse and fraud on top of the unauthorized surgery, and when the closing statements were delivered, the weight of evidence crushed any last defense. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before returning with the verdict guilty on all counts. Victor slumped in his chair, his arrogance drained, his eyes darting wildly as if searching for a way out that did not exist. Margaret wept beside him, still clinging to the man who had destroyed everything. Dr. Collins was declared guilty of malpractice and conspiracy, his license revoked on the spot. The judge's words rang like a final bell. "Victor, for your crimes of abuse, forgery, and medical fraud, you are sentenced to 20 years in state prison. Collins, you are sentenced to 10 years and permanent loss of medical practice." The courtroom erupted, reporters rushing out to file breaking news, spectators buzzing with shock. I sat there numb, the scars on my abdomen throbbing with every heartbeat, realizing that the control Victor had wielded over me for years had just been ripped from his hands in front of the world. It was not joy I felt, not yet, but a profound sense of release, the first breath of freedom after years of suffocation. As Victor was led away in handcuffs, he turned and shouted at me, "You think you won, but you will regret this." I met his gaze with a calm I did not know I possessed and whispered, "No, Victor, it is you who will regret." When the trial ended and the cameras turned away, I found myself standing outside the courthouse in the cool evening air, feeling both lighter and heavier than ever before. Victor was gone, taken into custody with his sentence hanging over him like a chain he could never break, and Dr. Collins had been stripped of everything that once gave him power. Yet the victory did not erase the scar beneath my bandages, the reality that something had been taken from me without my consent, something I could never fully recover. Margaret retreated into silence, refusing my calls, choosing to remain loyal to the man who had ruined her daughter, rather than face the shame of admitting her complicity. In the weeks that followed, the community shifted, some offering sympathy, others whispers of judgment, but I walked through it with my head high, determined to shape my own story. The settlement from the hospital gave me resources I had never imagined, and instead of hiding, I chose to build. I founded a nonprofit called Voices Unbroken, dedicated to supporting survivors of family abuse and medical coercion, and with each woman who walked through our doors, I felt less like a victim and more like a force. Speaking at small gatherings at first and later at conferences, I told my story not to relive the pain, but to show that silence had once chained me and that breaking it had set me free. Standing on stages under bright lights, I repeated the words that had carried me through the darkest nights. They stole my choice, but they never stole my voice. The phrase became a banner printed on flyers and worn on shirts by women who had endured their own forms of betrayal. Victor. I heard struggled in prison, stripped of control, forced to live under the rules of others for the first time in his life. Some said he paced his cell like a caged animal, raging at guards threatening lawsuits that would never see daylight. Collins, humiliated and broken, faded from headlines into obscurity. Margaret lived in quiet isolation, her neighbors turning cold, her once perfect image collapsing under the weight of truth. I grieved her loss even as she still breathed, because a mother who chose silence over her child was no mother at all. Yet in my solitude, I found strength. Rachel remained my anchor. Lisa, my unexpected ally, and David, my reminder that justice could be carved out of even the deepest injustice. Each scar on my abdomen reminded me of betrayal, but also survival. I began to mentor young women, teaching them how to recognize control, how to protect their autonomy, how to fight when silence seemed easier. At night, I sometimes stood by the window, touching the scars and whispering into the darkness, "You did not win, Victor. You never will." Years later, when I spoke before a legislative committee about the need for stricter consent laws, I felt the same chill I had felt in the hospital, the memory of the curtain closing and Lisa's whispered words. But this time, I was not a powerless patient. I was a survivor demanding change. My testimony helped pass a bill requiring independent patient confirmation for all surgical procedures, making it harder for anyone to repeat what had been done to me. When the law passed, reporters asked how I felt. I answered simply, "Relieved, because no one else will wake up to find their future stolen by forged ink and a man's arrogance." On the anniversary of the trial, I returned to the courthouse steps alone, standing where I had once trembled and closed my eyes. The ghosts of those days still lingered, but they no longer controlled me. They were part of my story, not the end of it. I thought of the girl I had been silenced at the dinner table, gaslit, until she doubted her own memories, trapped under the weight of a man who claimed to know what was best. She was gone, replaced by a woman who had fought in court, who had spoken into microphones, who had built a foundation from ashes. As I walked away from the courthouse, the sun warm on my face, I realized I was not defined by what had been taken, but by what I had reclaimed. My body bore scars, my heart bore memories, but my voice rang clear. And in that clarity was freedom.